The new era of trade and cooperation along the southern coast came at just the right time for Kaitahu. For some years, a vicious new style of intertribal wars had been raging across the North Island, the notorious musket wars. Iwi armed with muskets had wrought havoc on those tribes without these new weapons, killing thousands and forcing a dramatic exodus of the defeated that reshaped the tribal landscape across the island. And now, as the 1820s drew to a close, musket-armed war parties had crossed Cook Strait. Already, northern Kaitahu communities defending their strongholds with traditional weapons had been ruthlessly massacred by musket-armed northern war parties. The same fate inevitably awaited the tribe's southern Kaika as well, unless they could somehow match the invaders' firepower.
Then in 1829, a perfect opportunity for southern iwi to protect themselves presented itself. Sydney merchant George Bunn commissioned Captain Peter Williams to establish a whaling station in Preservation Inlet, and Williams picked a perfect spot here in Cuttle Cove, a harbour long favoured by deep-sea whalers seeking shelter from westerly storms around Furthest Strait. But in the new phase of relationships between Pākehā and Māori, it was recognised that this now meant negotiating with tribal leaders and making payment for the use of the land.
Williams made a deal with the Whakataupuka, the Ariki of southern Kaitahu, securing a site for the station in exchange for 60 muskets, 450 kilograms of gunpowder and the same weight of musket balls. Over succeeding years, further guns were handed over, as well as 2 cannons or carronades, assorted ironmongery, clothes and blankets.
This was the first documented land sale transaction in New Zealand, a deed formally recording the deal being marked in November 1832 with a drawing of Te Whakataupuka's facial moko as a form of signature. And this enabled Peter Williams to establish right here the first fully operational shore-based whaling station in the country.
It's my firm belief that the land itself wasn't sold, but the right to access the land was sold. So if we think about the construct of ahi ka, which is that idea of people keeping fires burning of the land, ko rākai hau tū, te tagata, nana tīmata te ahi, kei roka I tēnei motu. Rākai hau tū, the guy that got here in the boat in about 850, he lit the fires, those first fires. And those fires of occupation have been permanently and constantly kept going by generation after generation of whakapapa. So when we think about selling land, we can't sell ahi ka, but you can trade under the tikanga of utu, of a reciprocity, the right to access the land. Now, back in those days, there was pressure from other iwi coming down. So locally we thought, well, we're going to need 2 things to keep that balance in place when these other iwi come down and start trying to raid down here, Rabula and his crew. And one of those things is we're going to need some military might. If we side with the Takatapora, with the white people, sweet as, they'll be on our side, and plus we can get some armoury, we can get some muskets as well with that puti, with that money coming in. But also with that was that building of relationships of the people here. The muskets were one part of the technology, but the other parts of the technology were of course things like whale boats, and pigs and potatoes.
And those vital muskets made possible a Kaitahu fight back, powered from the deep south, that in short order drove the northern raiders back northwards again and re-established the tribal boundary 800 kilometres north of Preservation Inlet.
Thereafter, a thriving settlement grew up here. Maori and Pākehā living and working together to harvest the whales that called into Preservation Inlet every year after spending their summers feeding on krill in the Southern Ocean. By April or May, with their blubber layer at its peak thickness, they would arrive off the New Zealand coast and seek shelter in bays like this for their winter calving grounds.
In the past, Preservation Inlet would have been a great spot for right whales to bring their young as they're calving. It's a nice sheltered inlet. The same reason why people have sheltered here over the years is the exact same reason as to why the mothers would bring their calves in here. It's nice and calm, it's shallow. Outside the fjords there'd be a lot of krill, so the mothers would be able to go out there and keep their energy levels high.
The whalers would watch for whales from a high point, and as soon as one was spotted, the boats would push off for the hunt. Now once they got a harpoon or two into a whale, they'd hold fast and ride out its death struggle and then tow the carcass into this bay. It looks pristine here now, and the air is as fresh and clean as you could imagine. But back in the day, the scene would have been very different. A stinking, bloody scene of carnage as the dead whales were hauled ashore. Hoisted up high, they were then sliced into long, thin layers of blubber that were dropped into steaming tripods to be rendered down into oil.
It was filthy work. The men bearded and unkempt, their clothes soaked in whale oil, streaked with soot, the slime of putrid whale offal and blood. The reek of rotting whale carcasses attracted innumerable flies, scavenging birds, dogs and pigs, and would have been overpowering.
But the filthy trade in whale oil was also highly lucrative. Enough oil and bone might be recovered from a single whale to pay the running costs of a station like this for a whole season, and this particular station was hugely successful from the get-go, averaging at least 40 whales per season throughout its active life.
That brought mighty profits back to its owners 2,000 kilometres away in Sydney, and also offered rich rewards to the men who worked here, employed on contract, with different shares in the profits according to their level of skill and their role in the station hierarchy.
Of course, it was super dangerous work taking on the giant beasts out at sea. Back in 1822, when Captain Silas West of the sea whaler Indian was at anchor here, they spotted a whale out at the entrance to the harbour and set off in a whaleboat to harpoon it. But in its death throes, the whale, thrashing about with its tail, smashed their whaleboat to smithereens and then turned on the crew in the water. It caught Captain West in its jaws and crunched him. Now, his men managed to get him back on the boat, but he was badly mangled and he died 4 days later in agony. They buried him on the island at the entrance to the bay. Another infamous death that occurred here was rather more problematic. In 1835, ownership of the whaling station passed to John Jones and Edwin Palmer. Both of them were former sailors and Sydney-born sons of convicts. Palmer managed the station on site, and he was one tough man. In June 1837, an 18-year-old ship's deserter called Charles Dennehan that he'd given a job to at the whaling station lost control of one of the whaleboats, and it was smashed to pieces as a result. Now, whaleboats were the most important tool of the trade in a shore-based station like this, precious objects to be handled with the utmost care. Palmer was enraged. In his absolute fury, he turned on the boy and beat him to a pulp with a heavy piece of thick rope, delivering at least 30 strokes according to witnesses.
When the red mist passed, Palmer must have regretted his savagery, tending to the boy's wounds personally and providing the best first aid he could. Unfortunately, Dennehan died a month later, though it was said that it was some internal complaint that killed him, separate from the beating.
Nonetheless, the case caused such a stir that Palmer was hauled before the courts in Sydney and charged with manslaughter. It was the first time that such a case, an offence occurring in New Zealand, had been tried.
In the event, Palmer was acquitted, with key witnesses mysteriously disappearing from Sydney, spirited away, it was alleged, by Palmer and his partner Jones. But it seems to have been the death knell for the preservation in that whaling station, which was abandoned soon afterwards. Or perhaps it was just the beginning of the end for whaling. Like the sealers before them, the whalers had ruthlessly slaughtered their prey with no thought to conserving breeding stocks.
Within a decade, the industry had boomed with a string of whaling stations all the way up the southern coast to Otago Harbour and beyond. But now, it bust.
For most of the populations of the whales in this area, they largely got decimated by the whaling. It was super intense, and the breeding level of the whales was unable to keep up with the harvest rates. So the whales from the mainland of New Zealand have essentially gone all but extinct. But luckily, in places in the Southern Ocean, around the Auckland Islands and other places like that, the whale populations have managed to stay high enough that the populations of the right whales are starting to rebound, and those calving harbours are starting to become quite full, and that means that those mothers are starting to look for other places to bring their young, so they're starting to migrate back to New Zealand. We're starting to see right whales back in our harbours, which is really exciting.
Preservation Inlet had been a substantial settlement. Many well-known names in early southern history worked here in the 1830s. Peter Williams, of course, Edward Palmer and his younger brother William, and perhaps the most notable of all the Otago shore whalers, the Aboriginal Tommy Chaseland.
A giant of a man, famed for his enormous strength and prodigious eyesight, Chaseland was the chief headsman at the whaling station at Preservation Inlet in 1837 and widely regarded as the best whaleman on the southern coast. Eventually, he was to serve at most of the whaling stations right along Furthest Strait.
One incredible story from the southern coast has Tommy harpooning and capturing 11 whales in 14 days, an amazing harvest that cemented his legendary status in this part of the world.
It's tempting to think of this place as merely the squalid site of a brutal industry, and the tough men who worked here as equally harsh in their demeanour. But there's one story that comes down to us from the remote past that shows a softer side to these hard men of the pre-settler South.
A 10-year-old Sydney boy named George Prince was given a job here as an assistant to the cooper, that's the man who made the barrels in which the whale oil was stored and transported. In later life, when he was a wealthy Southland landowner, he fondly recalled his first Christmas in New Zealand at Preservation Inlet, when the men at the whaling station had made him a stocking out of an old fishing net and filled it with gifts. A homemade jumping jack, a model ship, a hammer and a tin of nails.
But perhaps the most important legacy of this and the other settlements that followed was the coming together of Maori and Pākehā, who lived and worked together in partnership at Preservation Inlet and the other whaling stations that followed. And then there was the fusing of the bloodlines. Shore whalers almost always took Maori wives, and large numbers of them settled down permanently in southern New Zealand.
Their mixed-race children were a new phenomenon, a group that strengthened the resistance of Kaitahu communities to imported diseases and formed a bridge between the cultures. Almost all Kaitahu families in the south can trace their whakapapa back to such unions.
A place like this, you get the feeling of those peoples coming together. It just adds to that idea of whakapapa, of difference but similarity, knowing the history of this place and the industry that happened, but also those people that came together sitting along these coasts, along through these sounds, along through those islands down Te Arakiwa, down to Whenua Hou. And then also knowing that after that, that dot, after that stuff all happened, then we just spread out into the landscape, all through from the east coast, all the way down and around here and beyond.
Today, the site of New Zealand's first shore-based whaling station is a peaceful location. Sporadic evidence of whaling and later occupation by gold miners is still evident, although the site has mostly been reclaimed by the Fiordland bush. But it is the water of Cuttle Cove that has brought maritime archaeologist Dr Kurt Bennett to this remote corner of New Zealand to inspect the seafloor in a non-disturbance survey of this historic site.
So, perfect spot to set up, have a few buildings out of the wind, and so nice and sheltered, good deep cove. You've got sailing ships coming in for supplies or picking up whale oil to take back to the world. So deep anchorages for them, then they come in, going to shore, it's fairly steep, so you can just run the boats up straight up on the beach, and so really well protected. But the other thing too is that when you go across the other side, you've got a nice vantage point out to the sound. The significance of this is that for the first time we're surveying the first New Zealand-based whaling station, not just land-based, they were interacting from the water, and so it's continuing any land-based survey out into the water and understanding what that landscape is. So joining the two to get a wider picture of the whole cove and its use and how people interacted with the environment. So I positioned an initial survey area based on the plan, so looking at where the concentration of the buildings or processing area was, and then so running some transects out from there. So it's just a controlled way to pinpoint any artefacts on the seafloor. The thing too is that there's such good visibility that we could actually see that area, and then noting anything on the seafloor that we saw. So then from the baseline too, that if we found an artefact, we'd measure out to that so we can make up a decent plan. We're looking for artefacts associated with that time period, bottles, clay pipes, and anything that's sort of fallen over the side. Anything to do with the whaling station really, metal, iron objects, maybe hoops for barrels, tools that might have dropped over the side. So just keeping a real good eye out for a range of artefacts.
The divers discover a variety of objects in the clear water, ranging from pieces of metal that could be associated with the whaling or later gold mining industries, through to more contemporary beer bottles.
It's not to say that there aren't other artefacts. I mean, we covered an area of 50 by 50, and that's not the whole cove. So there's real potential to come back, survey different areas, and build into any future research project.
The research from Kurt's survey paves the way for future archaeological investigations at Cuttle Cove, and he is thrilled with the experience.
Such an opportunity, and especially to spend time looking at these sites in depth and then getting to write up the results and then share that for the public. So it's an incredible opportunity, incredible place. It's remarkable that heritage agencies and museums are proactively doing maritime archaeology in places like this. It really brings the stories to the forefront and makes it more accessible for people.